YouTube script, The Horrific Final Days of Elizabeth I of England, Section 1. On February 24, 1603, inside the gilded chambers of Richmond Palace, a dying woman whispered a confession that would destroy the most powerful monarch in Europe. Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, had served her queen for 45 years, through triumph and terror, through war and peace, through decades when Elizabeth Tudor's word was absolute law across England. But now, with her final breaths rattling in her chest, Catherine clutched the Queen's hand and revealed a secret she had carried for 2 years like poison in her veins. A ring, a message of peace from the Earl of Essex, the man Elizabeth had ordered executed. A plea for mercy that had been intercepted, hidden, destroyed. A chance for reconciliation that Elizabeth never knew existed because Catherine had made certain of it. The Queen's reaction was visceral and terrifying. She struck the dying woman across the face, screaming words that echoed through the palace corridors, that God may forgive her, but she never would. This single moment of betrayal revealed after so long would mark the beginning of the end, not just of a reign that had transformed England into a world power. Would die standing upright, refusing to lie down for 4 straight days because she believed that if she went to bed she would never rise again. A queen whose face had been painted with toxic lead for so many decades that her skin had become a mask of damage and decay, cracking under the embalmer's touch like ancient parchment. A body so deteriorated from poison and disease that it would literally explode inside its sealed coffin during the funeral procession. The gases of decomposition building until they burst through flesh and bone with a sound witnesses described as a cannon shot. Haunted by ghosts she could no longer silence and betrayed by a body that had been slowly poisoning itself for years. By February 1603, Elizabeth was already fragile in ways she had never been before. At 69 years old, she had outlived almost everyone she had ever trusted, everyone who had known her as more than just a crown and a symbol. But Catherine Howard's deathbed confession was not simply another loss in a lifetime of losses. It was the revelation that shattered whatever remained of her will to continue. The French ambassador watching from the edges of the court reported that after Catherine's death, Elizabeth fell into what he called a deep melancholy with conceit of her own death, a darkness that seemed to settle over her like a shroud. She began complaining of sudden infirmities that appeared from nowhere, phantom pains that doctors could not explain and could not treat. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed she would sit for hours staring at nothing, her famous, sharp mind apparently empty, occasionally breaking into tears without warning or explanation. But it was not just Catherine's betrayal that haunted the dying queen. As her body weakened and her defenses crumbled, the ghosts of her past came flooding back with a vengeance she could no longer suppress. Sir Robert Carey, who was present during these final weeks and would later write about what he witnessed, recorded something extraordinary and deeply disturbing. The Queen, racked with guilt over decisions made decades earlier, began crying about Mary, Queen of Scots. 16 years had passed since Mary's execution, 16 years since Elizabeth had signed the death warrant for her cousin, her rival, the woman whose claim to the throne had threatened everything Elizabeth had built. Yet here was Elizabeth weeping like a child and, according to Carey, manifesting her innocence, insisting that she'd never truly given consent to that queen's death. The guilt she had suppressed for so long, buried under layers of political necessity and self-justification, was now consuming her from the inside out. Mary was not the only ghost that came calling in those final days. Elizabeth became fixated on Catherine Grey, another woman with royal blood whom Elizabeth had imprisoned until she died. Another threat eliminated, another decision that had seemed so necessary at the time. Catherine's grandson, Edward Seymour, was now circling like a vulture, positioning himself to claim the throne the moment Elizabeth's heart stopped beating. The irony was not lost on the dying queen, that her cruelty to one generation would now be rewarded in the next. While Elizabeth's mind crumbled under the weight of memory and regret, her body staged its own revolt. And the physical deterioration was nothing short of nightmarish in its progression. What had started in January as a simple cold had evolved by February into something far more sinister. Contemporary sources describe what they called a deflection in the throat, what modern pathologists now believe was quinsy, a peritonsillar abscess that filled her throat with infection and made every breath a struggle, every swallow an agony like broken glass scraping down her throat. The Venetian ambassador reported that her throat showed infected glands like almonds, swollen and painful and oozing with pus that she could neither swallow nor spit out. The throat infection was just the beginning of her body's betrayal. Elizabeth's teeth, what few remained after years of sugar consumption and mercury treatments, were black stumps of decay that caused constant pain. The dental abscesses had spread to her neck glands, creating a web of infection that no physician could treat. She could not eat. She could barely drink. The pain was constant and excruciating, driving her to the edge of madness. William Camden, the historian who recorded court life, wrote the grotesque detail with clinical precision. The ring had so grown into her flesh that it could not be drawn off. Think about that image for just a moment. The ring had been there so long, through so much swelling and weight gain and loss over the decades, that her finger had literally grown around the metal. King Richard III controlled the tower where the boys had vanished. He had declared them illegitimate. He sat upon a throne that rightfully belonged to his eldest nephew. Every moment those children drew breath, they represented a threat to his rule that no amount of legal maneuvering could fully eliminate. Even branded as bastards, public opinion could shift like wind. Loyalists could rally around them. In the brutal mathematics of medieval power, their deaths made perfect, horrible sense. The circumstantial evidence against Richard is overwhelming enough to convict him in any court of public opinion. He never produced the boys to counter the spreading rumors of their deaths. He never blamed another soul for their disappearance. When rebellions rose against him using the prince's names as rallying cries, he could have ended those uprisings instantly by parading the boys before the crowds to prove they lived. He did not. Foreign observers were even less subtle than English chroniclers in their accusations. In January of 1484, the Chancellor of France publicly declared that Edward IV's children have been killed with impunity, and the crown has been transferred to their murderer. This was not whispered gossip shared in shadows. This was international condemnation spoken in open court. But there is more, something that brings us closer to the truth than any contemporary accusation ever could. In 1502, nearly 2 decades after the boys disappeared, a man named Sir James Tyrrell was arrested for treason against Henry VII. Under interrogation in the Tower itself, the very fortress where the princes had vanished, Tyrrell allegedly confessed to murdering them on King Richard III's direct orders. According to this confession, Tyrrell had recruited 2 men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to carry out the actual killing. The method they chose was suffocation. They waited until the boys were asleep, then smothered them with their own pillows, pressing down until small lungs could draw no more breath. After confirming the children were dead, they buried the bodies at the foot of a staircase within the tower, covering them with stones to hide what they had done. Skeptics will rightfully point out that we do not have Tyrrell's actual confession in his own hand, only second-hand accounts written years later by men with their own agendas. But in 2024, researchers made a discovery that those skeptics cannot easily explain away. In a will dated 1516, they found mention of a gold chain that had belonged to Edward V himself. Where was this incredibly valuable piece of the boy king's personal jewelry, this intimate possession that should have been kept as a sacred relic of a murdered child? It was in the possession of Sir James Tyrrell's own family. Lady Margaret Keppel, Tyrrell's sister-in-law, left instructions in her will that the chain should go to her son, describing it plainly as his father's chain, which was young King Edward V's. How did the alleged murderer's family end up with the victim's jewelry? One theory sends ice through the veins. It was taken as proof that the deed had been done, payment for services rendered in blood. In 1674, nearly 200 years after the princes vanished, workmen renovating the Tower of London made a discovery that seemed to confirm the darkest rumors. Beneath a staircase, they found a wooden box containing 2 small skeletons, bones that appeared to belong to children of approximately the right ages. Given the persistent legend that the princes had been buried at the foot of stairs, these remains were immediately assumed to be Edward and Richard. King Charles II had them interred in Westminster Abbey in an ornate urn bearing the princes' names, as though the case was finally closed. But in 1933, when the urn was opened and the bones examined by experts of that era, the findings were far less conclusive than anyone hoped. The analysis suggested 2 children, one around 10 years old and one around 12. But the examination could not determine their sex with certainty, could not confirm their identity, and relied on methods we now consider primitive and unreliable. Modern scientists have pointed out numerous problems with that 1933 analysis, noting that age estimates could be off by several years, and that without DNA testing, we cannot even confirm these are the bodies of children from the 15th century, much less specifically Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. The solution seems agonizingly obvious. Test the bones with modern forensic techniques, compare the DNA to known descendants of the Yorkist bloodline, and finally give these children their names back. But here is the source of profound frustration for historians and investigators alike. Authorities will not allow it. The Church of England and the Crown have repeatedly refused requests to re-examine the remains, citing religious and ethical concerns about disturbing royal graves, And so we are left in this maddening position, where potential proof of the prince's fate sits in Westminster Abbey, just beyond the reach of modern science, close enough to touch but forever forbidden. Those bones could answer our questions once and for all, could finally bring peace to a mystery that has haunted us for 500 years. Or they could deepen the mystery immeasurably if they turn out to belong to someone else entirely, two different children whose identities are equally lost to time. The Tower of London still stands today, transformed from fortress and prison into a place where tourists walk freely through gates that once locked children inside to die. Thousands of visitors pause each year at the Bloody Tower, where tradition says the princes met their end. The spot where they played their final games is marked on maps. The staircase where bones were found is dutifully noted in guidebooks, but the tower keeps its secrets locked in stone, and stone walls do not speak no matter how many questions we ask them. Somewhere within those ancient walls, on some long ago night that history has erased, two boys disappeared. Whether they died quickly at an assassin's hands or slowly from deliberate neglect, whether they somehow escaped to live anonymous lives in exile or were coldly executed in their sleep, we may never know with absolute certainty. What we do know is this: two children who should have been kings became the most dangerous people in England simply by existing. And someone decided that their deaths were worth more than their lives. The princes in the tower remind us that history is not always neat, that some mysteries resist every attempt at solution no matter how desperately we dig. They remind us that power corrupts absolutely, that children have always been casualties when ambitious men fight over crowns, that even royal blood offers no protection when thrones hang in the balance. And perhaps most hauntingly, they remind us that some truths can be lost forever, buried so deep that not even centuries of investigation can bring them back to light. Edward and Richard did not just disappear from the Tower of London that summer in 1483, they disappeared from history itself, leaving only questions and shadows and an ache that refuses to heal even after 500 years.